Well, last week at the end of the lesson, Jeff Rice came up to me and he says, "Hey, I really liked what you said about that uniqueness." And he brought up something and I thought, hey, I want to share that with everybody. So we were looking at this aspect of, and Dave, I'll have you turn the light off again just to kind of look at this. And this verse talked about the uniqueness we have, each person having a unique set of gifts that the Spirit gives, and everybody's different. Well, it's kind of like this spectrum of light. We all don't have the same set of gifts, but when you look at this light, you notice how some look brighter and some don't look as bright to our eye. Well, in a lot of sense, and Jeff brought this out, he says, that uniqueness isn't always as visible equally either. I mean, there are some gifts that tend to be a whole lot easier to see than others. Yet we still have that uniqueness where here we have, and I showed this last week, is that each person has a unique set of gifts. So your uniqueness, not just in your giftedness, but in your talents, in the things you're interested in your circle of relationships, in your circles of influence, you're unique. There's nobody else like you. And in all the billions of people on this earth, there's only one of you. And there's nobody else like you. And that uniqueness. And so putting that uniqueness kind of into action is what we're looking at today. So that was just something I wanted to share as we move forward. Okay, Dave, you can turn the light back on. I don't have any more colors to ooh and ah everybody today. But let's take this aspect of how we respond. And before I go any further, let me just remind you that what we go over today, very applicational, but none of what we go over today is to attain, retain, or maintain your salvation. This is just a response because you already have it and can't lose it. So we're in kind of a comfortable position as far as that's concerned. But now, again, how do we respond? And of course, Jesus says this: how are you going to let people know that you're my disciples? Well, this is kind of where we left off last week, is to love one another. And when we do that, it's kind of a testimony or a witness that we are Christians. And like I said last week, we're going to focus on a couple of things. This week, it's looking at loving one another. And so if you looked at the worksheet and you went through that this week, you saw that there were a lot of one another verses that I picked out. There's more, but I just had a few examples. And this is kind of like love in action and an attitude. And so we're going to look at some of those one another verses. And as you do that, just try to visualize what it looks like. What does that look like? And we'll start off with something simple, something easy. Romans 16:16, and the whole chapter of Romans, you can't get away from the word greet in there. Greet this, greet them, this person greets you, this person greets you. And it kind of culminates with this: greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, don't get hung up on the holy kiss aspect, okay? We're not going to have a class on that. That's more of a cultural thing than it is a specific way to greet. So for us, there's that exhortation. Greet one another. So when you think about that, and this is what I want you to think about for a moment. How do you like being greeted? I mean, some people just like a hi, some people like a handshake, some people like a hug. My family growing up, when we would greet each other, we would just kind of be like this. I mean, there was no hug and that kind of thing. Now my wife's family, on the other hand, they're huggy and kissy kind of people. Okay, at least when I first met her family, her mom's side of the family was that way. So that was kind of an adjustment because there's not just the aspect of how do I like being greeted, but how do they like being greeted? So as you think about that for yourself, you think, well, I hadn't really thought about that, but how do I like being greeted? And, really, I'm still kind of okay with the, but if you want to give me a hug, that's fine too. I used to tell a story about that in my classes. The kids would always talk. At some of the schools I taught at, they would tell us, well, we'd like you to stand at the door and greet the students as they come in. Well, and you get them a handshake or whatever. And now think about this. You have all these different people coming in from who knows what's going on in their family or what kind of health issues are going on, and you're supposed to be shaking hands with everybody. Well, I ended up doing the fist bump kind of thing rather than shaking hands because inevitably there's going to be something passed along because you walk down the hall and you see the kids going, and you're going, but just the fact that you acknowledge them, they appreciated that. And I think for me that was enough. But have you ever thought about that? How do you like being greeted? Or are you aware, how do they like being greeted? Some people kind of have a circle of space that if you get in there, they're really kind of uncomfortable. I used to have a colleague who he'd talk to you and he'd get about this far from your nose. And it's like, it's kind of, you just hope there's not a wall behind you so you can still back up. But that's kind of simple. And again, to me, this aspect of just the sensitivity of it, being aware, greeting, and being sensitive to how other people like to be greeted. So something simple to start with. We can do that. All right, let's continue on. We'll kind of go down the list. I think this is pretty much the same list as you have on the handout. Romans 12:10 says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor." Now, in your mind, as you think of that word devoted, what does that mean? When you think of devoted, what comes to mind?
Faithful.
Someone who's faithful, okay?
Loyalty.
Loyalty, okay. Say that again, I didn't.
Looking out for you.
Okay, someone who will look out for you. Okay.
It's a level of commitment
It is a level of commitment, yes.
beyond just casual, how you doing?
Yes,
It takes time.
it takes time. More than just a casual commitment. All right, so there's obviously a little more involved than, I get along with them. What about giving preference to one another?
Put
Renee?
others before yourself. I
putting them before yourself. So you, okay. Well,
He said sticking together.
oh, sticking together. Okay. Sally.
It'd be like us in childhood, when you had two halves of a cookie, you would take the smaller one and let the other person have the larger slice.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, as opposed to when you break there was some movie where they broke the candy bar in half, and they said, well, they're not even, and the one holding the longer one goes, where they are now. You know, it's so, yeah, giving preference. Whenever I saw this, those kinds of things came to mind also. And also, and this was really a difficult thing in my family, because in my family, on personal preference things, there was also this strong desire to be right and for everybody else to agree with me. Or it was kind of a trait in our family growing up. So we would say things like, you really don't want to, or you really don't need to, or you don't want that, you don't need. But that idea of giving preference is, I don't have to impose that on somebody. I'm free to let them make whatever personal preference decision they want. So it's not as if we stand at the door and spend a half hour going, no, after you, no, after you, no, after you, no, after you. But rather, sometimes it's just a matter of not having to get my way all the time. Easier said than done at times. All right, let's move on. Romans 15:7 says, therefore accept one another, just as Christ also accepted us to the glory of God. And I thought, okay, here's the question that I had. How did Christ accept us? What was his, what did he do? What was his attitude? So on and so on and so on. Yep.
We are tremendously flawed because of our sins, and he accepted us and loved us. He loves us anyway. He loved us enough to die on the cross for us.
He loved us despite our sin. That verse in Romans says that God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. I mean, that's definitely something that's kind of hard to wrap our minds around, but accept one another like Christ accepted us. Any conditions? As I think about this, do I put conditions on people to mark them in the acceptable column that Christ didn't put on me to mark me in his acceptable column?
Yes.
That's a tough question. I have to say, yes, I do. But it doesn't mean that I have to agree with everything that they say or do or think, but yeah, it's kind of a challenge.
Waiting for somebody else to get their act together so that I might accept them
Yeah.
is absolutely the opposite of Christ's love for us.
Yeah.
Had he waited for us to get our act together, nothing would have ever happened.
He'd still be waiting. Yeah. Yeah, Sharon.
I was thinking about when Jesus had the Pharisees come to him claiming that
Right. He didn't wait until we were acceptable, but he understood that there are things that we may think or do or that aren't good for us. And so he moves us in the direction away from that and more toward himself. And we can do that for others as well. Obviously. All right, let's look at Ephesians 4:2. And focus on the first part of this as you think through possible examples of this. With all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another. That word tolerance in some translations is bearing with. The word tolerance in our culture has been given some interesting definitions, but that aspect of bearing with, in my mind, if I'm bearing with someone, how do I want to put this? I might be a little annoyed because they're not going as fast as I want them to, or I know it's going to take time to work through something, so
To bear something means it's a burden. And whatever about that situation is burdensome to you, you're told to bear it.
yeah. And in the first part of this is what the challenge is. There's plenty of burdens to bear. That's not the issue. But how do I deal with it? Humility and gentleness and patience. I guess that is kind of the tough time. And as you think through this, do you think of times when you've had to bear with someone or tolerate something? I mean, it may not be a sin issue. It may even be just something that you deal with that just you got to go through.
It may just be an inconvenience. It may be lack of comfort in the situation.
Mhm.
So the differences we have sometimes make us uncomfortable. But a lot of times it may be just, it's not convenient right now for me to deal with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. John?
I would say it also involves giving one another the freedom to be immature. We're all growing up.
Mm-hmm.
We're all maturing and recognizing that we're going to act immature as a believer, as a person, and everything else. And we show tolerance for immaturity like you do with a child.
Yes. Yes. And regardless of where in that relationship it's happening, whether we're the one that's being bared with or we're the one that's bearing with the other, its attitude should be seen. Deb?
We need to remember that we're not perfect, that we
Yeah.
fail all the time, too. So we shouldn't be puffed up or think that we're so great and someone else is struggling with something that, you know.
Right. Exactly. We're not perfect, and the wisdom of the Lord in sharing this, putting the attitude up here, humility, gentleness, and patience. Yeah.
When you talk about humility, along that same line, I think, there but for the grace of God go I. Not as a way of saying, oh, I'm superior to that person because I have already, taken care of that in my life, but to remember that God meets out grace at different times to
Yes.
And like John said, we are all maturing at a different rate. That's where humility comes in.
Yeah. We're not all at the same point in our relationship. Positionally we are, but experientially we're not. So, yeah, it's good to remember that. Good to remember that. And like you said, this one this week is, and I told Terry when I left this morning that I said, you know, I said, what are you doing? Oh, she says, oh, I'm just working through the study you put out. And I said, yeah, I've had to work on that all week. You know, in the sense that yeah, a lot of these have come to life this week with taking care of her after her surgery. But she did the same thing when I had my surgery 4 years ago. And so we understand. And it's not always easy, but the direction is there. Well, let's, I don't know if these are going to get progressively more difficult, but maybe not. We'll see. In 1 Thessalonians 5:9 through 11 says, "For God has destined us, has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we will live together with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build up one another, just as you also are doing." Now, the one another there is the build up and encourage. But what's the premise of this encourage and build up? Yeah, encourage each other because we will be living together with Christ forever. And for me, it was almost a reminder of, hey, you know what? This material world isn't all there is. If it was, man, how depressing would that be? I mean, especially as we get older. I was talking to a friend this week whose mother had passed away, and he was telling me about some of the struggles as his parents got older and some of the health issues that he and his family have dealt with. And I shared that verse about, this really comes to mind or becomes a lot more personal, the verse about the outer man decaying, but the inner man being renewed day by day. And he goes, yeah. And he and I went to college together. He says, yeah, he says, you know, when you're younger, you just kind of blow right through that one. He says, now, it's a lot more relevant, it seems like. I said, yeah, that's true. But are there other ways other than that you think of that you can encourage people or build them up? And think about yourself. What do other people do that encourage you or act to build you up or energize you? And that's going to be different for everybody. But, you know, if you want to share that, feel free to do that. You know, what kinds of things do people do that encourage you? Sharon?
I was thinking about the so-called 5 love languages. You know, people feel love in different ways. So some people really just enjoy a good hug, and other people it's words or gifts or you know just time, spending time with people. For me, I think spending time one-on-one is always encouraging.
doing things to acknowledge people, spending time, lots of different ways that people can feel loved. And if they feel that from you, it probably encourages them. I stopped and talked to Dita this morning and thanked her for sending that note to Terry after her surgery, because that was a real encouragement to Terry. So just things like that are, and Jeannie too, that she appreciated that, you said. But things like that. And it's not even anything necessarily really big, but if someone sends a text to you saying, hey, I was thinking about you, how you doing? You know, that's an encouragement.
Jeff,
Yes.
yesterday I had lunch in Kansas City with a young man that I was instrumental about a year ago in getting into a position with ministry. And there was an older man with us that I knew and he didn't. And so I got him to sharing with the older man some of the progress that he's been making. And then I pointed out to him my observations of how he has grown in the past year,
Yeah.
partly as a result of the role that he's been in. And having him share that with this other man, I think was an encouragement to him. It showed that he had value. He had something worthwhile to share with two older men.
Yeah. That's good. So you ended up kind of modeling that behavior for him, in a sense.
And it was real. I mean, you don't make up stuff
Right.
and compliment
Right.
people. Because if it's hollow, everyone knows it.
Right.
But it was a joy to point out to him his own growth, which he's probably not as aware of as it is obvious to me.
Right. Yeah, sometimes we are extremely critical of our own walk with God or whatever, and to have someone come up and say, I really appreciate this about you or what you shared or what you did, it can be a big encouragement. John?
In a tangible way, if you've got a large project at the house, somebody comes up and says, well, I'd be happy to come over and help you, that's very encouraging. And that's true in ministries.
Yes.
So if there's others that could say, hey, is there a way I can help in this ministry, that really encourages those.
Yeah.
Maybe leading the ministry or, taking ownership, whatever it might be, but big encouragement.
Right, right. Coming alongside somebody in ministry or just being supportive and helping out. Tremendous encouragement. All right, well, let's continue to move along here. This was a verse we had last week about what to do with our freedom. We're called to freedom, brethren, only do not you turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. So the aspect of serving one another. Now, this verse says, through love serve one another. Is there another way to serve one another? I mean, well, maybe we kind of take that for granted, but why would it be stated this way? Through love, serve one another.
Because it's honesty.
Because what?
Honesty.
It's honest, okay?
You can serve people out of obligation. You can serve people because it's your job.
Yeah,
But whether or not you really show love as defined by the Bible in that service is a little bit more of a challenge, I think.
right. There can be in a sense, a forced servitude, but this is not a forced servitude. Is it, Sharon?
I think if we start with the right attitude, if we have love, then that's when our
Yes. Love is that pure motive that kind of initiates the action to serve. Yeah. Jeannie?
I think there's a verse, and I can't think now where it is, but you know, we're supposed to show hospitality, not begrudgingly. You know, think, okay, I have to make this meal, I don't have time, but I have to do it, you know, whatever.
Right. To do it cheerfully rather than because I have to. Yeah. Big difference between have to and want to. Love wants to, obligation has to.
There's the whole idea too of the motivation is it right, have you really done it in God's eyes?
Yeah.
I mean, does it count? Really?
Yeah. And we understand that God understands or knows the real motivation behind it. Yeah. Deb?
I think it all boils down to do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Yeah. How do you want to be treated? That's, it does kind of boil down to that.
In general thing that I think is very obvious, but sometimes when we're with friends, we get into a negative mode and somebody starts complaining about something, and pretty soon somebody's complaining about something else. And before you know it, time has passed and you've been griping with each other.
Yeah.
Instead of saying uplifting things and encouraging things and reveling in the blessings.
Yeah.
It's amazing how even people who consider themselves positive can slip into that.
Sure. Sure.
And I've done it numerous times. I always feel bad later.
Don, we all have. It's not unique. But yes, that's true. That's true. All right, here's a similar kind of verse. This one talks about bearing one another's burdens. And we talked about, this is different than bearing with. Bearing with is kind of a patiently waiting for someone to come along or till the situation is alleviated. But this aspect of bearing another's burden, the context of this verse really is in the aspect of restoration from a difficulty or even a trespass, to help someone with their trouble. And so when you think of bearing another's burden, what kinds of things come to mind for you? Dave?
And back to the context, I think it's specifically talking about sin of a believer. I think it opens up with, if anyone's caught in a transgression,
Mm-hmm.
it's talking to believers.
Yes.
So it's not just an annoyance, which could be a burden, I think
Right.
it's sin.
Right. So it could be dealing with some kind of a sin that someone's going through and help them bear that burden. Yeah. All right. I'm going to try to move along here. Here's an interesting passage. It says, "And concerning you, my brethren, I myself also am convinced that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to admonish one another." Well, what does admonish mean? I looked that word up, and when I first see the word admonish, I think of someone shaking their finger at you. But that's not necessarily what this is. When I looked this up, it is more along the lines of to give instruction, to help someone see the truth of the matter, to help them gain some understanding. And it's not a verbal lashing as much as it is to give aid so that they understand what the truth of the situation is. And so rather than a harsh meaning, it really was, rather than, I'm going to make sure that you know the right way, as opposed to, I want to help you understand what the Lord says in His Word, or because I care for you, I don't want you to go down this road, or very different attitude. And so, but it does have the context of correcting an error or concern that there may be something not being reasoned through correctly. But notice, again, the qualifiers here. Full of goodness, filled with knowledge. First of all, you got to know what you're talking about, and also it's got to be done with the other's interest in mind. So, a little bit different. I'm sorry I'm going through this pretty quick, but I wanted to kind of end, to give you a few minutes to think through, and a lot of people have brought this attitude up, this idea of humility. You know, Deb, you said how you want to be treated. Well, yeah, if you're thinking about somebody else in respect of how you want to be treated, then you're humbling yourself to help them. Renee, you mentioned the humility aspect, and 1 Peter also says it, but this is interesting. This is in the context of relationships. The middle of this verse says, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. How do you clothe yourself with humility? Think about that. Because the opposite is, it says, what's the opposite? Well, the opposite is somebody throwing the cloak of humility over you, which, you know, isn't always the most pleasant thing to have happen. So if you humble yourself, it's better than having somebody else humble you. Yes.
I think
Larry.
it's important that whenever you look at this verse, you also look at verse 6, where it talks about humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so at the proper time, He may exalt you, casting all your anxiety upon Him because He cares for you. And I think, you know, one of the things when people say humble yourself towards somebody else, there's always that fear, okay, what are they going to do with that? What are they going to think of me? What is that going to actually mean practically? And, you know, I think this verse recognizes that there's a lot of fear.
Yes.
You are putting yourself under somebody and giving it as a measure of control, whether control is the right word, but you basically are giving people a certain level of power over you. And that, I think that's why God talks about the fact there's an element of anxiety, which may anxiety, lack of trust, who am I going to humble myself to? What's this person going to do with that?
Right.
And God says, well, really, you're doing it as obedience to me, and I'll take care of it.
Right. Yeah, there is a definite anxiousness to do that because of that aspect. That it makes me vulnerable. And what if they take advantage of me? Or, I mean, not that I think any of you would take advantage of me, but I'm thinking, but you still think that. And so we, like, good word there, Larry, we end up trusting God. Cast all that upon Him because He cares for us. So, I don't know how you clothe yourself with humility, but and get good at it, because there are definitely some advantages to that. At the end of the worksheet, there was I encourage you to look up any other one another verses that you may have come across. So if anybody did that and thought, hey, this is kind of cool, I'd like to share that. If anybody did, I want to give you an opportunity to do that. So if you did, I'm checking homework. No, I'm not. I can't help it. The old teacher in me. See, I just used an old teacher technique on you. Silence. Well, I had one I found that I would like to share. It just simply says, live at peace with one another. So I thought, that's a good one to end up on. Next week, this week, we looked at one another, and in other words, within the context of the body of Christ, how we treat each other, attitudes, actions, and demonstrating love that way. Next week, we're going to look at the other aspect of this, which is how do we demonstrate God's love to people that are not in the body of Christ. And just, there's lots of different things. We'll just focus on a few of those. But for the same purpose, how does God get glorified when we do that? So we'll attempt to look at that next week. So let's go ahead and close in prayer, and we'll get